Hello, how
How
are
are you?
you? I'm good. How are you doing?
Good.
We're good.
All right.
We just wanted to start by thanking you for taking the time to be here.
No, thanks to you for the invitation.
We'd also like to start introducing what we're doing, this is, and then we'll also having a land acknowledgement, and then we'll start with the interview.
Okay,
So,
sounds good.
okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this inaugural interview session, which will be kicking off our CARE U of T virtual interview series. Throughout these interviews, we will host discussions that pertain to the core values and mission of CARE, the work and initiative that CARE engages in within Canada and across the globe, while also focusing on political, social, and justice-based issues around the world. With this interview series, CARE U of T will be striving to produce engaging and informational sessions that will encourage discussion, thought, and action regarding social injustices, international relations, and global issues. Many different opinions and thoughts will be shared throughout this series and in the comment section. However, we are dedicated to maintaining a respectful environment free from racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, and any other form of discrimination. Additionally, though we are all tuning in from different areas of the world, it is important to recognize the land upon which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the tradition of the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across the total island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As worded by Northwestern University, it is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek and to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation.
Great. Thank you, Sara. So in this first interview, we're excited to be hosting Roman Andres Zarate. Roman received his bachelor's and master's degrees in economics at the Universidad de los Andes and completed his PhD at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He also held the role of postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on Behavior and Inequality from 2019 to 2020, where he now works as a research affiliate. Currently, Roman is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on the intersection of the economics of education, development, and organizational economics. Furthermore, Roman is part of the affiliated faculty in a project with the School Effectiveness and Inequality at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's evaluating the effect of exam schools and affirmative action policies in Chicago. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
No, thanks to you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, awesome. So, I guess we'll start the interview now. All right. So I'll go with the first question. So our first question is, how differently did countries in the global south cope with the pandemic in comparison to the countries in the global north?
So I think that overall it's more complicated than the global south versus the global north. You see, there is a vast heterogeneity in the coping of the pandemic, both across and within continents. For instance, the numbers show that compared to most continents, Africa has done a good job controlling the spread of COVID. Latin America, on the other hand, has some of the worst numbers in the world. I am not an expert in the African context, and I think that it will take some time to understand their success, but some people hypothesize that despite the lack of resources, their healthcare system is prepared to deal with COVID-19 due to their experience with other epidemics, such as the Western Africa Ebola virus between 2013 and 2016. There is also a different response within the continent itself. For instance, South Africa has worse statistics in terms of both cases and deaths than the rest of Africa. By contrast, Latin America is a continent that on average is richer than Africa, but it has had very challenging times dealing with the pandemic. Part of that is probably related to the high levels of inequality, as Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. You would expect that income inequality translates into different access to healthcare and insurance. And most countries in the region have been affected despite differences in the approach of the government and the implementation of policies. Just to give you a very concrete example, the Peruvian government responded very fast in terms of both lockdowns and economic aid. But yet, and this is very unfortunate, but Peru has the highest mortality death rate in the world. Part of that, it's probably related to inequality, as 71% of the working force is employed in the informal sector. And this is a very common phenomenon in Latin America. Informality rates are usually very high for all countries in the region. These workers usually live in urban areas and have to consume what they earn per day, so they could not stay at home during lockdowns. They had to go out to work, and of course, this accelerated the spread of the virus. But again, there are some differences within the region. For instance, Uruguay has managed to control the spread of the virus with only approximately 50 deaths so far.
Wow, I did not know that they had like so little deaths there. That's pretty impressive for like an entire country.
It's been, I think that the management in Uruguay has been great so far.
How do you think, sorry, Sada.
I was just going to add to that. I was wondering, because currently right now I'm in Egypt, and like a lot of the times when we look at the numbers here, we see that the numbers are going down, the deaths are going down, but that's not often true, because I know that it's not going down. It's just like kind of like a government covering it up. So I was wondering, is that the same case in Uruguay, or is it actually that like it's good, they're controlling it?
I actually think that they are very transparent with their numbers. So I actually think that it's true that they are controlling the pandemic so far.
All right, I was just gonna ask a really quick follow-up question, just because it kind of has to do like Uruguay and like how they've had so little deaths, whereas you talked about like, you know, the inequalities between like incomes and jobs and stuff like that has kind of resulted in different results across Latin America. So how do you think, like compared with Brazil, where rates are very, very high, like what sort of differences in like demographics, like the socioeconomic realm are there between Brazil and Uruguay?
So I think that first, Uruguay is a smaller country. So Uruguay only has 3 million population size compared to Brazil, that's it's around 220 million, I think. So I guess that it's easier. You can think that it's easier to manage smaller than bigger countries. I also think that there are some differences in inequality between Uruguay and Brazil. So Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. I don't think that is the case for Uruguay. And actually, I think that, I mean, and this is, of course, there are some caveats with what I'm going to say, but I think that there is, as this is a more equal region, people have also a different type of approach to certain cultural values and to comply with certain norms, and both because of access to public services, but also to some sort of citizen behavior.
Okay. Thank you for expanding on that question.
So we also wanted to ask you, to what extent do you believe that the previous efforts to end the global poverty will be set back due to the current pandemic?
So there was a report last week, a report by the World Bank. It is called Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2020, that shows that this appears to be a case. And you know, poverty reduction has had a terrible setback with the pandemic. And according to the World Bank, for the first time since the last 90s, it is expected that the global poverty rate will increase next year. Overall, the bank projections suggest that in 2020, between around 90 million and 115 million of people could fall back into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. And they expect also an additional increase between 23 million and 35 million in 2021. So these are very big numbers. But it's not only that there are going to be more poor people in the world or people living under poverty in the world. It's also that these new poor people look different to what the average poor person looked like before the pandemic. So overall, they appear to be more located in urban areas. They also appear to be better educated, and they also appear to work less in agriculture. So it's not only that the numbers are rising, it's also that the composition of poor people in the world is also changing.
That's very interesting. Do you think that the approach to try to get those people out of poverty after the pandemic will be, of course, different than the approach that is currently being taken towards the people in poverty right now, right?
So I think that those differences are going to be important in terms of policy. I think that governments need to think out what is the composition, what is the composition of the global poor or the poor people in their own countries, and think out specific policies that are targeting those different demographics. I completely agree with you that the approach has to be different.
Just another follow-up question. Do you think like as you said, a lot of these people who are in extreme poverty, like there's going to be like in more urban areas, like they're going to be better educated. Do you think that, I guess, since poverty will be, you know, proverbially more in people's faces, that governments will be more apt to act to reduce this poverty and like create solid solutions that can be applied across the entire country and like in other global circumstances?
So can you repeat the question? I think that.
Yeah, sorry. It was kind of confusing. Like, do you think that because of the prevalent, like, obviously, according to the World Bank article, there's going to be a big increase in global poverty, and a lot of it's going to be centered in urban areas. Do you think that because I guess there's a lot more people living in urban areas, so a lot more people are going to be exposed to this poverty, they're going to see it, that the governments are going to want to reduce the rates of poverty so it's like, you know, less visible, and that therefore they're seen as like, you know, a more like socioeconomically developed country or have a better reputation?
So I think that I mean, there is a big effort to reduce poverty in the world, regardless. That was already in place before the pandemic, and I hope that that's not going to change. What is true is that I think that governments in general are trying to provide some sort of safety nets to the new poor, and you can see this with different economic aid policies that have been implemented in the world. So, for instance, in Peru, they were very fast at providing these economic aid to people that were affected by the pandemic. So I think that it's out of both. I hope that there is no this big substitution between one and the other.
Okay. All right. So we'll move on to the next question that we have, and that is, why and to what extent has the pandemic placed those in informal jobs across different regions in the global south at more risk than those in formal ones?
So I think that it's definitely true that the pandemic's impact between the informal and the formal and the informal sector in the economy, that there is a big gap there. As I said before, so for instance, in Peru, some people believe that the high mortality rate is due to having 70% of the working force in the informal sector. I think that overall there are two reasons for this. One is the type of occupation in the informal versus the formal sector. So usually it is the case that jobs in the informal sector are usually unpredictable, or income in every day is unpredictable. And in environments where social distancing is in practice impossible. So for some of these occupations, not for all of them, but for some of these occupations, complying with social distancing policies was very challenging. The second factor that of course is related is that people in the informal sector do not have ways to cope with risk. So including, and that's going to include the consequences of the pandemic. So for example, most of them do not have access to any sort of unemployment insurance, and most of them probably don't have access to a financial sector or savings. And during the lockdowns, when you hear some stories, some families had to decide between eating a day or exposing themselves to the virus. And if you add to that the losses due to the economy's slowdown, then the situation for the jobs in the informal sector is just catastrophic. No, for a family with jobs in the informal sector, those were very challenging times.
All right. So I was wondering also, do you believe that the increased reliance on the internet right now that education has moved online, a lot of the jobs have moved online, could it possibly extend, which could extend beyond the crisis? Do you think it will widen the individual and global inequality gap? And if it would, then how would it do so?
So let me relate that question to education and remote learning. I guess, as you mentioned, there has been also a move to online works, and that's another aspect that is probably going to change. And people have found some differences there due to a sort of occupation. So as we were discussing between formal and informal jobs, it is more likely that you can work remotely in the formal sector than in the informal sector. But as you mentioned, there is also this issue with education. And you can think that there are indeed going to be massive losses in human capital due to the pandemic. In the short run, I think that the reliance on the internet will actually widen those gaps. So in general, low-income families and low-income schools have limited access to the internet and to technology. And governments all around the world are dealing with how to provide educational resources to these families. So for instance, in Latin America, the strategies have combined general guidelines for parents on websites, television and radio. And in fact, according to a phone survey that was conducted by the Ministry of Education in Peru and Innovations for Poverty Actions, there is an organization that helps in the implementation of research. Most students in Peru are actually using television and radio to keep up with school. The survey also reveals that only 1/3 of the parents have access to the internet and almost exclusively through a smartphone. So educational content has to be adapted to this type of technological device and the fact that most of these families actually do not own a computer. So when you compare them with high-income families, those high-income families have first better access to the internet and second, more technological devices plus other school resources, such as teachers that know more about technology. And of course, virtual learning and distance schooling is also a challenge for them. But still, when you compare a student that can interact with their teachers and with her peers via Zoom to one that has to do all her schooling via radio or TV without those interactions, you would expect that the pandemic is in fact increasing the learning gaps. And for instance, there is some evidence of this in the US. The Opportunity Insights team, that is a research center led by Raj Chetty, who is a professor at Harvard University, conducted a study to measure the pandemic's economic consequences in real time. And to measure the impact on learning, they partnered with CERN. There is an organization that provides math programs that combines both in-person instruction with digital lessons. And before the pandemic, approximately 800,000 students were using this platform. And when they measure educational progress in this platform after the lockdowns, they find a very vast gap by income group. So while the impact is only slightly negative for the wealthiest schools, they actually find a tremendous negative impact on schools in the bottom quartile of the income distribution. So I think that overall there is actually real evidence and current evidence that shows that the access and the reliance on the internet have actually widened the gaps on learning. But I think that we also have to remain positive and hopeful that this provides an opportunity to understand the role that technology can play in improving learning and closing education gaps. So on the one hand, precisely due to the pandemic, policymakers are understanding what are the costs of in the long run and of underinvesting in technology. So, for example, the government in Peru is trying to actually provide children of all regions in the country access to the internet and to technological devices. And the advantage of this is that we would expect that the use of these technological inputs are going to go beyond the pandemic. So if governments are investing in educational technology today, these investments can also use in the future, and hopefully they will help to improve learning and reduce the education gaps once the situation is done. The key challenge, and this is something that there is some research on this, but I don't think that we have all the conclusions, all of the evidence, is that we need to learn how to use technology effectively. And what is clear from the existing evidence is the idea that technology by itself is not enough to improve learning. Both policymakers and researchers and people in academia, we need to learn what are the essential complementary inputs to technology, such that by providing technology, we can actually generate achievement gains in students. I think that there are some insights and silver linings in existing research though. So for instance, we know that to be effective, technology needs to be flexible enough to adapt to children's needs. So for instance, educational software need to adapt to be able to teach at the right level. So there is some evidence, and this is related to the Nobel Prize last year, that basically shows that, so if the best way of a kid learning is when the teaching is at the right level, not by grade, not by age, but it's able to adapt to the specific needs of each child. And we can think that if technology is going to be useful in the future, then we need to create softwares that are flexible enough to identify what are the exact needs of each child, such that the platform adapts to those needs. There is also some recent evidence on how to use low-cost technology to implement interventions to improve learning. So Young Love, there is an NGO located in Botswana, conducted an RCT of 2 low-technology interventions to substitute schooling. And these were SMS text messages that basically they sent to parents with few basic numeracy problems of the week. And they also complement these messages with phone calls. And they found pretty promising results. They find that this very low technology type of intervention actually could increase learning between 0.16 to 0.29 standard deviations, which these are very large numbers compared to other type of interventions and to in-person interventions. So overall, I think that, of course, this is closing the gaps, but I also think that this is actually giving us the opportunity to have some creativity and to have some innovation in terms of how to use technology and how to use distant devices to improve learning.
That's very interesting, because you'd always think that if a country is low income, then it wouldn't be able to use technology to its own benefit. But this whole experiment is very interesting to see how, with a lower budget, they were still able to use technology to their own benefit. That's very interesting.
No, yes, I think that paper is amazing, and it shows that, as I said, I think that it shows that people are creative and people can think out ways of actually dealing with the pandemic. And I think that the lessons that we are going to learn from this is actually something that will go beyond this particular time.
Mm-hmm. I like the point that you made about how this time is like given us the ability to be like a bit more creative with like how we're using technologies to allow kids to learn in like different ways, whether that's like using a smartphone or an iPad, and you know, not just like having it for specific kids, but for making it totally widespread and accessible for everybody.
Yes, I think that's I mean, I hope that, as I said, I hope that there are 2 sides of these. And I hope that in the end, the positive side is in the long run, the positive side is going to be higher than the negative one.
For sure. All right, so the next question that we have is, what do you believe are the long-term implications of moving education online in less socioeconomically developed countries?
So, as I said, I think that it will depend on the balance between the human capital losses due to school closures today and whether we actually learn more effective and low-cost ways of using both old and new technology to improve learning. I think that it is still uncertain to what extent the current situation will affect the delivery methods of education in the future. But I think that we should remain positive that in addition to the obvious losses in human capital, this situation is going to bring some innovations and more effective ways of remote teaching. And as I said, as all of this infrastructure, governments are already investing on all of this infrastructure, I think that is something that we are going to be able to use in the future.
So we've established that, of course, technology is something that countries will have to focus on in the future. And I was wondering, like, were there other cracks in the infrastructure of countries in the global south that international community only took notice of during the rise of the pandemic? And if that is true, do you believe that this global attention will cause both the leaders of the countries in the global south as well as the leaders in the developed nations to take action to remedy these cracks?
So I think that people were aware of these cracks, but they became more salient due to the pandemic. So for instance, so I have worked a lot in Peru, and this is the reasons why I kind of know what is going on there. But their healthcare system was not prepared to deal with the virus, and eventually, as other healthcare systems in the world that actually had more resources, it also collapsed. And To be honest, I'm not completely sure that there will be changes due to COVID. I think that in the short run, so I think that to have changes in something like the healthcare system, this is going to require very long-term investments. And I think that in the short run, the priority of the governments is actually to control the disease and the recovery of the economy. So I don't know how many resources do governments have today to do these very large investments. And I don't know whether in the mid and in the long run, I don't know where we would actually have a sense on the urgency of making these investments. So I hope that it is the case, but I'm just not sure. What I do think that is true is that, again, I think that for some reason, these terms of crisis actually brings up creativity in people. And there are some specific examples that even with these cracks, societies know how to innovate in terms of crisis. So for instance, let me give you just a very specific example, but there is now a high demand for ventilators, or especially back in March to May, where the pandemic was very critical all over the world. There was a huge demand for ventilators globally, and for some countries in Latin America, it was basically impossible to import them during the pandemic's peak. But somehow, some countries were able to create their own ventilators. So, for instance, in Peru, there was a partnership between a local university and a very big consortium of private firms, and they were actually to create their own ventilator, and they are actually using it in their hospitals. And Uruguay also created its own ventilator itself. So overall, even though there are these cracks, I think that in terms of crisis, regardless of from the government or other sectors that usually it's their job to type of provide these services, people are also becoming creative, are innovating, and are actually learning ways of solving the crisis by themselves.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer. And that was a really interesting example that you cited as well. I think like I worked in a hospital a few months ago, so I was doing cleaning, like I wasn't in like medicine or anything like that, but like I think right now we're like in that like sort of triage stage where we're like, and especially like back in like March and May, like when you said like, you know, people like in Peru, like it was like all these different people were coming together to address like the immediate problems, which need for ventilators. I think we're still kind of like in that stage, but also, you know, as rates are going up and down and fluctuating across the globe, we're still kind of in that limbo of like in triage, that's like also trying to like move forward and see how we can like implement like this creativity and innovation and other ways to make for a more efficient and like safe society in the future. All right, so you kind of touched on this on in previous answers, but do you believe that the previous spread of different diseases, such as Ebola and Africa, contributed to better disease control in the region?
So, as I said, I think that people hypothesize that this is the case. And for instance, Uganda has less than 10,000 cases so far and only around 200 deaths. So part of their success, according to the health ministry of the country, is precisely that, is that this is due to their experience with their disease outbreaks, as they have been able to learn how to identify specific factors that contribute to the management of a health crisis, what are the factors that help to the spread of a virus. And they have been able to build some institutional capacity to both prevent, detect, and respond to the COVID pandemic. So I think that for Africa, it is indeed the case that the Ebola crisis have actually helped them to how to manage this.
Also remember that you mentioned earlier that pandemic control in Africa was better than that in Latin America. So this question is specifically regarded to that. So in 2015, 2016, the Zika virus epidemic was announced in areas of North and South America, with the disease also spreading to areas in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Although Zika is a mosquito-borne virus, it can also spread via sexual contact and from mother to fetus. Do you believe that the Zika epidemic contributed to better disease control in the region? And how does political leadership and ideologies influence how countries approach epidemics and pandemics?
So I think that those are two different questions. So let me start first with the Zika virus. And what I will say is that given the experience of Latin America with the virus, I don't think that is the case that Zika actually helped to deal with the pandemic. I guess that this is probably related to a difference in the transmission of COVID and Zika between humans. And of course, I think that this is just an opinion based on a pretty notorious fact that are the differences across countries and across regions in the world. I guess that it would be good to have some sort of correlation within country to estimate the incidence of COVID-19 in areas with more and less exposed to, that were more and less exposed to a Zika virus to have a better picture. So we in the same country compare different areas. I guess that will give a better sense on whether Zika actually helped or not in the management of the COVID spread. For your second question, that I think that is related to political leadership and ideologies, I think that it is indeed the case that this has affected the pandemic, how governments approach the pandemic and how people respond to it. And I think that there is some evidence supporting this in both the US and other regions in the world. So for instance, there is a very nice paper by Nicholas Eisman, Tiago Cavalcanti and Daniel de Mata that study the impact of political ideology on adopting social distancing measures in Brazil. And what they do is that they are able to use very geolocalized mobile phone data to measure whether actually people are engaging or not in social distancing. And what they find is that after Bolsonaro started dismissing the risks associated with COVID, the engagement in social distancing in pro-government localities was declined compared to other places that are actually less supportive of the government. So ideology in fact appears to influence policy, but it's not only through the direct impact on what are actually the measures that are being adopted by the government. It is also through an indirect impact because people of different political ideologies are actually changing their behavior.
That's really interesting. Okay, so this is our last formal question, but if we have any questions or if you have any questions for us after this, we have time to go through those. So despite most Caribbean countries having almost fully recovered from hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, with the exception of Puerto Rico, which has experienced multiple earthquakes earlier this year, the islands in the region are still at risk of experiencing a hurricane or tropical storm season. According to the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the biggest concern at this time is resource availability. So in other words, personal protective equipment for UN personnel and inhabitants of the region, coupled with pandemic-related restrictions inhibiting hurricane preparation activities or dress rehearsals. In your research and observances, do you find that people are more apt to react, respond, or donate to issues that are closer to their own homes? So, example, Americans donating to wildfire relief funds, or are people more inclined to donate to a cause that is more remote to them? Following that, do you believe that if individuals were more well informed of global issues, rather that they would be more willing to seek justice by donating to organizations or by giving their time? Or do you believe some people prefer willful blindness, so not watching the news or not reading articles, to remain comfortable and to maintain a peaceful perception of the world around them?
So I think that it is true that people respond more in favor of causes that are close to them and are more empathetic towards others with whom we share a similar background. I think that I wouldn't call it willful blindness, as being exposed to different perspectives can be costly, and it is difficult to assess who is actually willing to bear that cost or not. But what I find hopeful is that there is existing evidence that shows that there are ways through which specific policies can actually improve our perspective and our empathy towards others. And overall, I think that there are three factors that appear to be very effective at changing behaviors towards outside groups. One is information, the other is contact, and the other is actually educational and pedagogical programs. So let me give you an example for each one of them. So for instance, regarding information, Do you know what is an implicit association test?
Oh.
So usually when people get asked the question, do you discriminate? Do you think yourself as a racist? Do you think that you have more preferences for men than for women? Those kind of questions. When these questions are self-reported, people usually say that is not the case. So a group of psychologists at Harvard come out with a measure that is called the implicit association test. That is something that you can take online in a web page called Project Implicit. And basically, it's a test that associates good and bad things with certain groups. And it takes like the differences in microseconds that you take associating one group with one element of good or bad things versus the other group. And that is a measure of implicit association, because that's not something that you can control. That's not something that you self-report. It's just something that it's on your own behavior and how you associated those two groups. And there is some recent evidence in Italy that actually shows that when teachers are informed about these implicit biases, that they are favoring natives or immigrant students, they actually, and this is done just before they are grading immigrant students, they find that this increases the grades of the immigrant students. So what they do is that they compare the performance of immigrant and native children in a blind test. So they are comparing two students with the same performance levels. One is native, one is immigrant. And what they find is that even though their performance is the same in the blind test, teachers are actually grading them differently. But when teachers learn about this implicit bias, then they actually reduce that gap in the grading scores that they are giving to the students. So overall, I think that this is a very powerful message, because it shows that even though we might have some biases in favor of certain groups, we could be unaware of this. And once we learn about it, we are willing to change our behavior. So, and I think that's something that can apply to other type of policies, because people can have these implicit biases, but the fact that they are willing to change their behavior, it's showing that there are some changes in perspective. So I think that information is a powerful channel to create some sort of out-group prosociality. But there are two others. The second one is contact, and there is Alport's theory on contact theory. And in fact, I think that today having more diverse schools or workplace could actually have an impact on altruism and discrimination. In fact, one of my favorite papers is authored by Gautam Rao, who is an assistant professor at Harvard. And what that paper finds is that when rich students are integrated with poor students in India, they actually become more prosocial and discriminate less by socioeconomic status. There is similar recent evidence studying contact theory using sports teams. So for instance, Matt Lowe, who is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, studies caste integration using cricket games in India. And Salma Musa studies whether integration in soccer teams can actually reduce prejudice between Muslims and Christians. In that sense, let me relate this to a previous question, but I think that technological investment during the pandemic actually provides an opportunity to connect people that usually don't share a physical space. So for instance, I'm actually thinking on starting a project with the Ministry of Education in Peru on how we can use technology to connect the students in different schools, in different regions, with people with whom these students usually don't have the opportunity to interact. And related to this, there is also a very nice virtual platform called Empático, and it operates way before the pandemic. But what they do is that they connect classrooms in different parts of the world, so that kids actually aged between 6 and 11 years can have more perspective on how other kids in the world actually approach life. I think that's a very nice example on how actually technology can be used to improve educational programs. The third type of useful policy to reduce prejudice and to create some sort of outgroup prosocial behavior are actually educational programs and specific curricula targeting perspective taking. So this is a project that was conducted by Sule Alan. There is a professor at the European University Institute. So she partnered with the Ministry of Education in Turkey, where they designed the evaluation of different specific educational programs that each one of them was targeting a specific non-cognitive skills. And one of these programs was on perspective taking. Or the perspective taking ability of children. And the evaluation results of that program are very promising. So they find that the program significantly reduces peer violence in the schools, reduces social exclusion, and reduces also ethnic segregation. So overall, this program, that is a curricular program created by the ministry, actually was very successful at improving pro-social behavior. So overall, even though I think that it's true that people tend to favor their own groups, and this is something that you would observe also on charity giving and on favoring certain causes that are close to me, or causes that are not that close to me, I think that there are ways to change that. And I think that the three aspects that I mentioned, information, having more diversity such that we interact with people different to us, and well-designed educational programs have been, the three of them have been very successful at changing and broadening people's perspectives.
That's a very interesting perspective on the topic, because I was also wondering, just to add to that, would like kind of integrating people in societies where there is like severe classism or stuff like that, of course, would it make it like a little bit harder to try to integrate people from different like socioeconomic levels?
Yes, I think that's usually the case. So, for instance, in Latin America, there is a very large segregation in the education system by income level. Usually, there is these private elite schools, and you have. And I mean, you have the thing with the education system in Latin America is that they're very good elite private schools. There are also very bad private schools. But overall, you observe that there is this segregation by income level or on the school system. So I think that generating ways of promoting more integration are actually good. And as I said, I think that the pandemic is providing some opportunities to also think about that.
Molly, do you have any more questions to ask?
I don't have any more questions, but again, like I really appreciate like how in depth you went with that answer. And it was like, as you were like saying all these different things, like just like volunteering with different organizations, I was like, oh yeah, like, you know, like I've like oftentimes gone to like my local communities to try and get their help because I'm like, oh, it's a local cause, like they're gonna want to support it. Whereas like international, like widespread causes, some people are like you know, as you said, if there's no contact, there's no information, there's education, we're gonna be like, oh no, I'm less apt to donate to that. I'm not too sure, but no, just that's definitely impacted the way I'll go about thinking and donating to organizations in the future. So thank you for that.
No, my pleasure. I mean, as I said, I think that there are ways of changing that, and what is cool is that this is very rigorous science actually showing that this type of things actually work.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We just wanted to thank you so much for your time and for taking the time to be here with us. This was amazing. We've learned so much and we loved hearing your views about all those questions. Did you want to add anything else at the end of the interview?
No, I just want to say that I think that is great, the work that you are doing. It's great that you are connecting the U of T community with these global topics. And this is precisely the kind of things that bring people together, right? I think that part of the thing with the pandemic is that it's something that all the world is facing together. And precisely kind of thing, I think that this type of media is what creates these connections between people at different places in the world. And taking this perspective to U of T students, I think that is awesome. So thank you very much for the work that you've been doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for having this first interview with us. I know Sada said thank you already, but I think we've set a pretty high precedent for future interviews. So thank you so much.
No, again, thanks to you.
All right.
Okay.